Good morning and welcome to yet another exciting edition of 7th grade social studies. I hope everyone had a fantastic Columbus Day. For those of you that don't like history, you should at least appreciate the fact that Columbus discovered the New World, and because of his discovery, you got a day off. All right, well, let's begin. Today we're going to talk about the Reformation. We're going to look at some of the causes of the Reformation and some significant contributors to this movement. Okay, first of all, let's recap. Take a look at the impact that Renaissance had on the Reformation. Now, you remember there were a couple of key factors that caused the Renaissance in itself. One of those was humanism. Now, remember, humanism sparked a deep interest in classical literature. Basically, a lot of thinkers and scholars of the time are looking at Greek and Roman texts and studying these ancient writings. What this caused during the Reformation was for a lot of scholars and theologians, monks, people of that nature, to really begin to study the Bible in a really intensive manner. And this caused many of them to begin to question the authority of the Catholic Church, because what they were reading in the Bible wasn't lining up with what they were seeing in the church world. Another thing to remember is that the city-states. Remember, the city-states were key centers of trade, both of goods and ideas. A cool way of thinking of them would be to think of them as the internet of their time. There was just these huge centers where people could gather and talk and pass ideas from one to another. Another key invention and factor that had a huge impact on the Reformation was the printing press. Now, you guys remember Gutenberg was one of our big figures. With the invention of the printing press, people didn't have to copy things down manually anymore. So this allowed for literature and pamphlets, articles to get out to the populace in a faster manner. Okay, so once again, here's just a picture of those cities. Remember Genoa, Venice, Florence down here. So these cities played a key role in the exchange of goods and ideas all throughout Europe, and not just Europe, but in the East and in Africa as well. So our goals for this short video are to define what the Reformation really is, briefly examine the causes of the Reformation, and to introduce several significant contributors. And here's some pictures of some guys that were pretty important during this time period. Okay, for my language arts people, the prefix in the word reform really means just again. And so when you put those words together, to reform would be to bring back to its original form or shape, or to fix something that has either been broken or damaged. So the technical definition for reformation is the act or process of reforming an institution or practice. An institution could be something like a church, or it could even be marriage. Marriage is regarded as an institution. For our social studies purposes, the correct term or definition is the 16th century movement for the reform of abuses in the Roman Catholic Church. So that's the main thing that happened during the Reformation. People were trying to fix problems that they saw in the Catholic Church. All right, let's take a look at some of the causes of the Reformation. Over here you see we've got the Protestant Reformation. One of the things that happened was corruption and worldliness. A lot of people began to see some things that they really didn't like in the church. One of those was the selling of indulgences. Now, indulgences was a release from the punishment of sins. Basically, what you could do is you could purchase these indulgences to get, let's say, your loved one out of purgatory or hell. So regardless of what crimes or sins they committed, as long as you're willing to foot the bill for their deliverance or freedom, all you had to do was pay in cash. Another huge problem within the Catholic Church was this thing called simony. Now, what the church did was to sell influential positions within the church for money. And so you technically didn't even have to be, quote unquote, a Christian or a Catholic practitioner in order to gain a position or entry level in the church. Another problem during the Reformation, or during the period right before the Reformation, was a political conflict between the Pope and European monarchs. Now, at this time, European monarchs really began to assert their authority and power, and they weren't too keen on sharing that power with the church. Now, the church had been a huge political influence all throughout the Middle Ages, and they had been a main force of stability during the Dark Ages as well. Catholics also resented the fact that they not only had to pay taxes to their respective kings and queens or whatever part of Europe they lived in, they also had to pay taxes to the church. So essentially, they were getting double taxed. And last and not least, there was the Great Schism. This actually, for those of you that like history, there's some political intrigue and religious intrigue going on here. Beginning in 1378, the French king actually sent soldiers to abduct the Pope, and they took him to France. And so during this time period, there was actually a moment in time where the Catholic Church had three different popes. Now, that caused tremendous amount of confusion in the Catholic world. Who are they supposed to follow? Who are they supposed to listen to? So not only was the Catholic Church dealing with corruption and worldliness and conflict between kings and queens, they were having, quote unquote, a civil war in their own church. Quickly, just wanted to show you this again. This is a look of Europe right before the Reformation, and right during the Renaissance. Right over here, you'll see the city of Wittenberg, which is going to become important for us later on in this video. Here you've got the Papal States. This is where Rome is. So this was the seat of the Catholic Church. And that's something you can reference. You all should have this worksheet. You can reference as we conclude our study on the Renaissance and the Reformation. Okay, quickly want to run through some very key contributors to the Reformation. John Wycliffe translated the Bible into English from Latin. You guys remember Dante and his Divine Comedy? Well, the reason why that was such a big deal during the early stages of the Renaissance is that Dante took Latin and translated it into the common day vernacular, the common day everyday speak of the Italian people. He essentially was the first to really kind of put the Italian language as we know it today into focus. So Wycliffe was doing the same thing. He's taking the Bible, which was for decades, for centuries, could only be read in Latin, into English. Jan Hus took the ideas of John Wycliffe and spread them. He also believed that the Bible should only be the true authority, not the Catholic Church in itself. In other words, not the Pope, not the priest. In other words, the way to decide how to live your life, you should get that information from the Bible. He was actually later burned at the stake for his teachings. Another influential guy is Erasmus. He was a humanist that wanted reform in the church. Now, a lot of the early reformers really didn't want to break away from the Catholic Church. What they essentially wanted was to fix the problems within the church. He wrote a hugely popular and influential book called The Praise of Folly, or Foolishness. Basically, he was criticizing and making fun of the corruption that was going on in the church, and his goal was to reform it. Here's a pretty neat quote: Erasmus laid the egg and Luther hatched it. So these were guys that kind of paved the way for Martin Luther to come on the scene. Now, you guys remember Martin Luther from the first video on the big figures of the Renaissance. Interesting story about him. He promised God that he would become a minister if he made it out of a frightening thunderstorm. So he was terrified during this thunderstorm, and he made this vow: "Oh God, oh God, oh God, if you just save my life, I will promise to serve you for the rest of my days." And he did. He became a German monk, and he began to thoroughly study the Bible, like a lot of these theologians and scholars had began to do at this time. And during his intense reading of the Bible, he discovered that many practices of the Catholic Church, like the selling of indulgences and simony, were just not biblical. He could find no precedent or no area in the Bible where it talked about these things. Also, the Catholic Church had 7 sacraments or rituals that they practiced, and Luther said those weren't biblical as well. He found no basis for them. He only was in favor of 2 sacraments, which was water baptism and the Holy Eucharist, or as we call it today, Holy Communion. So Luther penned his 95 Theses, and he nailed them to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany. Now, this was what is known as the spark that caused the fire for the Reformation. In his 95 Theses, Martin Luther is basically calling out the Catholic Church on all the things that he sees that are wrong. Now, keep in mind and remember that Luther at this time did not want to break away from the Catholic Church. He simply wanted them to fix the things that he thought were wrong. So Martin's ideas were printed and distributed, remember the printing press, and so his ideas are starting to get into the hands of the common people. The Catholic Church immediately condemned him as a heretic, basically said that his teaching and preaching was false, and they threatened to excommunicate him from the church. Basically, this means if Luther didn't get his act together and quit preaching, they were going to kick him out of the church. Well, Luther, man that he was, flat out refused. He went to a trial, and he decided that he would rather lose his life than quit preaching what he viewed as the truth. So Luther was excommunicated. He actually went into hiding for several months because lords and kings actually sought his life, and he started his own church movement known as Lutheranism. Luther taught the Bible as the final and only authority. So once again, he's building on the ideas of Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, saying that the Bible is supposed to tell us how to live our lives, not the Pope or the Catholic Church. Luther was also instrumental in translating the Bible from Latin into German so the common people could read it. So next time we're going to look at some of the contributions that individuals made to continue the Reformation movement. We're going to take a look at John Calvin. Also, from your big figures of the Renaissance, you see that familiar faces again, Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I of England. Also next time we'll look at the Christian family tree, because of the Reformation movement now there wasn't just the Catholic Church, there was the Protestant Church as well. See you next time.